Hello, this is the Green Corn Rebellion Show. I'm Gregory Harden II, and today I'm here with Mauree Turner, who is the state representative for District 88 in the Oklahoma House of Representatives. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. I'm doing really good. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming on. Uh,
Whoa, 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 whoa. Stop what you're doing. Okay. If you like this video and you like the other content on my channel, please hit the like button on this video. Also, go hit subscribe, like right now. And also, when you hit subscribe, click the bell so you can get notifications whenever I put out a new video. So, thanks. Alright, enjoy the rest of the video.
so first, tell me what was your first session like as a first-time state representative? What was that like?
It was interesting, right? So I've been working around the Capitol for the past 5 years leading up to this session, right? And so I've been able to sit in session, um, uh, sit in sessions, sit in committee hearings and interim studies, but it was very different being on this side, I guess, of the desk, so to speak. uh, it's one of those things where you try to prepare yourself as best as you can, right? And you still like aren't as prepared. So there are a lot of there were a lot of curveballs thrown that I didn't expect, but I was always been the type of person to kind of roll with the punches and keep going. So I don't know.
All right, that's cool. So what all happened during this session?
A lot. Wow. I think anybody who was watching Oklahoma's session kind of specifically, everybody that I've talked to anyway, right, who has seen the way sessions work over the past few years, right, is said like this has probably been one of the wildest sessions we've seen in a few years. Some folks say in the entire time they've watched sessions, right? We saw a lot of bills that really kind of doubled down on the fear mongering narrative around what happens, right, when we listen to community organizers, right? What happens when we give communities resources rather than lock them up and put them in jails and prisons, right? And so there were pieces of legislation to strip away people's access to our First Amendment right? At a time when evictions, right, in a global pandemic, at a time when evictions were increasingly on the rise because people couldn't afford to continue to pay rent. They had to choose between rent and the basic essentials to provide for their homes and their families. We saw people double down on legislation that would allow landlords to continue to evict people, right? And we saw bills where folks directly attacked our trans children, and all of this yet again, right, in the middle of a global pandemic. And so I mean, I guess that's kind of like overarching, and I think we might talk about some specific bills, but yeah. So at a time to really care for communities, like that was really kind of easy fixes, right? To care for communities, we made sure that we didn't do those things, right, or didn't do them in an equitable manner if we did. So yeah.
Okay. Um, so what bills did you propose and did any of them get passed?
It's a good question. So this was my first session in Oklahoma. How session works is that you've got 8 slots. So you've got 8 chances for a bill to hit the governor's desk. But you can write as many bills as you want. So I wrote 14 in case a couple of mine didn't get committee hearings. So you have the opportunity, if a bill doesn't get a committee hearing, you've got the opportunity to switch it out with another one. So I wrote 14 in case some of mine didn't get committee hearings. It turns out none of mine got committee hearings. So, but the types of legislation I wrote a bill that would make Oklahoma policy gender neutral from 2022 session forward. So in my legislation, when I get it back from bill processing, I make sure that it is written in a gender neutral way. And some people actively tried to do that, and bill processing would send it back and say, like, here are some corrections, and the they, them, theirs would turn into he and she and his and her and things like that. And so made it just kind of a legislation to make that an easier process. I also created a piece of legislation that would allow gender neutral markers on all state issued IDs, all state issued identification. I wrote a bill that would put an end to, um, uh, so I guess the way to explain it is that in Oklahoma, if you are sitting in a holding facility, a detention center, a jail, and you haven't been convicted of a crime just yet, you can get a fine and or a warrant out for your arrest in another county if you miss a court date there. So I created a piece of policy that would put an end to that. I also created a couple of pieces of policy around restoring voting rights. So to folks who have been released from prison, so that they have access to vote as soon as they're released from prison. Because right now, if you have 10 years, you get out in 5, you still have to wait that extra 5 years before you can register to vote again. So I had a piece of legislation to do completely away with that. And said as soon as you're released from prison, you can vote again. I wrote the legislation that way because in my mind, I was like, I'm going to try to work within the system that I'm going into. I personally would love to see everybody, even the folks who are currently incarcerated, be able to vote again. So that will probably be a piece of legislation that I write in the future. On the front end, folks who are so many of the folks who are sitting in our county jails at any given time are only there because of state sanctioned ransom, right? They can't afford to pay their bond. And so what happens in our nursing homes is that someone can request an absentee ballot, and it triggers the election board. And so what they'll do is take absentee ballots out to everybody, allow them to fill it out, gather them up, and take them back to the election board. So the same thing for folks who are currently sitting in county jails and detention facilities and things like that. Let's see. In Oklahoma, in just about every municipality, it looks very different to become a law enforcement officer in all of them. So something to standardize that, because some of the discrepancies are things like for mental health checks, the requirement in some places is that all you have to do is pass a lie detector test, which is not based in science. And I'm not really sure like how that's considered a mental, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure like how that's considered the mental health portion of that kind of onboarding process. And so to standardize that and things like that. And also I think, and one of the things with that is also raising the age limit to 25 across the state, because science tells us that your brain isn't fully developed until you're 25. So
What is the age now? It's 18, right?
I believe it's like 18, 19 in some places, 21 in some places. So yeah.
Wow. That's pretty crazy that even that varies. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, and I won't talk your off about all of them, but yeah. So those are kind of like the big pieces.
All right. Episodes of the Green Corn Rebellion Show are sponsored by Oklahoma Progress Now. Oklahoma Progress Now is a 501c4 organization focused on building progressive power in Oklahoma. Their primary efforts are on developing progressive content for a 21st century audience, coalition, and capacity building across progressive organizations and causes, and working to see elected leaders who are more responsive to their constituents and the needs of the many. Areas of focus include progressive messaging and communications, coalition building and resource sharing, and focused progressive policy goals. You can check out their Twitch live streams, and they go live on Facebook at noon, Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Please support this organization. It's a really great organization. It's just getting started here in Oklahoma. Thank you. Now enjoy the rest of the video. All right. So what did you think about the budget that was passed and what all was in it?
A lot, right? But I think kind of the key components right now are, and when we're in a time, and I talk about the notion of like reimagining and rebuilding our justice system. And I think that we should be doing that with all of our systems, right? Especially how we create the budget, and how we dish out those dollars. And so a couple of the big things with Oklahoma's budget, right, that folks are talking about right now is how we are, so the Equal Opportunity Scholarship Fund and how that works, as well as let's see, the Equal Opportunity Scholarship Fund, and also, right, how we fund our district attorneys, right? I think those are kind of the two big conversations that I continue to see. And so with the and the Equal Opportunity Scholarship Fund really kind of lends itself to a bigger conversation around public dollars going into private institutions. So in Oklahoma, we've got roughly 700,000 public education students and roughly 35,000 private education students. And so with the Equal Opportunity Scholarship Fund, is that how it works is like if you make a contribution, that contribution is then allows you to have access to a 50% tax credit, right? So 50% of that will be a tax credit, so you don't have to pay it back in state taxes, right? And then if you commit to that same amount for the following year, then you get a 75% tax credit, which means less and less money that's going back into Oklahoma's general revenue, right? Oklahoma's revenue to be able to give to public education students specifically. And so the money is divided evenly between public and private institutions, right? But when we talk about the fact that we've got 700,000 versus 35,000 students, you still are dividing less money for all 700,000 public education students, right? And so we talk about this as well as the fact that in private education, you only have access to private education if private education also chooses you, right?
Yeah.
Private education, those institutions aren't beholden to the fact that aren't beholden to not being able to kick people out for minor discretions. There are folks who are kicked out of private institutions as well as charter schools for administration finding out that they are queer, right? There are students who are kicked out if their parents don't participate in the PTAs enough, right? And that is so students who attend private institutions as well as I guess kind of charter institutions aren't subject to the type of scrutiny or are subjected to a tougher type of scrutiny when it comes to who can stay and who has to leave. It also doesn't talk about the mechanism for because these contributions, right, anybody can make them, right? And it's any amount. But the thing about it is the only folks who are making a substantial enough payment, right, to where 50% tax credit, to where a 75% tax credit really means something to them, right? To their pockets are the people who are paying a lot, right, to this scholarship opportunity. And so think like that's a significant chunk of money that's not being put into our public education system. And so it's kind of this slippery slope into how we might say that we are allowing an opportunity, right, for public education to get more money. But what we're really doing is dumping more money into private institutions and further widening this gap between public education and private education and who we save and why we save them, right? And also this idea of like how we critically think about how we take care of our public education systems, right? Because it's going to be there. It should always be there. Not everybody has access to go to private institutions. And not everybody wants to go to a private institution. We had this really great opportunity to make sure that we were actively funding public education and actively funding our teachers and our support staff, right? And decided to dump more money into private institutions that are doing fairly well, as well as district attorneys, right? So the way we fund district attorneys is we essentially allow our district attorneys council to say, I am going to charge you with this crime and we're going to arrest you. And we are also going to make you pay us to arrest you, right? So those fines and fees that people have to pay once they're charged by a district attorney go straight back into the office of the district attorney. And so what the Democrats have done, the budget that the Democrats created, right, was a budget that paid district attorneys out of general revenue, right? Because we've got the money to do it in Oklahoma, we just don't, right? We've got so much money left over in our rainy day fund, and Oklahoma has been seeing some downpours lately, right? And has not used the rainy day fund, right? And the money in general revenue to do it. And so we have created this budget that allows us to lean on general revenue to fund district attorneys rather than leaning on the marginalized and disenfranchised to pay to keep the doors open at the district attorney's office. And so this notion, right, is something that this notion, right, the work that we're doing to make sure that we're leaning into the true sense of reimagining and rebuilding our justice system, right? And so we're leaning away from it by saying, like, we aren't signing on to any new crimes, we aren't signing on to any new fines. And when I say we, I mean specifically me, right? I think it's a conversation, right, on both sides of the aisle that takes people a little bit longer to kind of get used to, because in Oklahoma, the way things have always operated, right, is that if someone steps out of line, then they are just a bad person, right, and that they need to be punished, right? We weaponize our justice system as a place for revenge rather than rehabilitation, and I don't think anybody ever really meant it to be a place for rehabilitation. And so, so the conversation about like what it truly means, right, to provide resources rather than a sad misuse of power as a solution to people's everyday lives, because people get trapped in the justice system, right? It's not something that's new or revolutionary or a concept to think about, right? The fact that people get trapped in our justice system and then leave and are still essentially trapped, they just don't have to be in the walls of our prison industrial complex, right? And so making sure that we are not just saying, right, that Black Lives Matter, right, not just saying stop Asian hate, not just saying, right, that we care about our LGBTQ2S plus community, but actually walking that walk. And so being able to turn away from this idea of new crimes and new fines and move into a place that reimagines what resources in our communities look like through the budget was something that we started doing as Democrats, right? Now, the budget that Democrats created looked a lot different than the budgets that than the budget that our governor put forward, right? But I think that's also something to kind of talk about, right? When we saw the presentation of Oklahoma's budget as it is now, it was this kind of panel of, I believe, I think two folks from the House, two folks from the Senate, and then so our appropriations chair and vice chair from each place in the end. The Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, and the governor, right? And this is 7 cishet white men that made the budget for Oklahoma, right? And it doesn't really have our people in mind. And by our people, I mean our most vulnerable Oklahomans. And so, sorry, that was a very long-winded answer. I don't know.
No, you're good. It was good. So
Episodes of the Green Corn Rebellion Show were brought to you by Addie Sugar Shack, located at 1228 North Interstate Drive in Norman, Oklahoma. Norman's new shaved ice concept. They feature 45 flavor options plus unique snacks. They love the vibe. It's worth the drive.
what were your thoughts on redistricting?
It's been an interesting process. I will say, like, being elected in 2021, like there were a lot of things that like don't really happen in like every year that were very interesting, right? So to come in at a time where we are redistricting at after we had shut down early in 2020 session to handle the pandemic and come back and try to do things in a new way, right? There were just like so many new things. And so redistricting, trying to learn all of that and what that looks like. And I was like, yeah, this is my district. And I forgot about redistricting or the part of the actual redistricting, right? Where your district looks different. So But sitting in those meetings was like very interesting, right? From the ones where we had community input, right, to being able to go into the basement, right, into the redistricting office and hear the input that folks from House District 88 had, right? People would write in and say, like, I just want to make sure that that the Gatewood neighborhood stays intact, right? Or I don't want to get carved out of the district, right? Things like that. So I think like that was kind of the most interesting part for me. What happened, or the numbers, how we have it right now, because we haven't got our federal numbers just yet. And so the numbers that we're estimating is that House District 88 lost roughly 2,000 voters. And so we have to grow to pick up that number again, because everybody's got to have roughly the same amount of people in the district.
Yeah.
And so we kind of we used to do a little zigzag from 13th to 10th. And so now what it looks like is a straight line across 10th. We come all the way down to 10th. And then at 10th and 44, like I-44, we jet out and go out about 2 neighborhoods. But other than that, everything else in the district is still kind of intact. We lost a little bit to a little bit of the north to Sydney, to Representative Munson. But I think that's really about it.
Okay.
But did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did.
Okay, sorry.
Is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
I don't know. I mean, I guess the important thing about it all, right? There are a couple of kind of key lessons I learned during this session, right? And it's one, I think it was something I always kind of operated in, but I think this session really kind of hammered away, right? To expect the unexpected. I think the theme of this session in Oklahoma was heads they win, tails they flip again. And so, which was it was wild to kind of watch. It was wild to watch people talk to, like people would talk to you beforehand on the floor, and then about a bill or something, and would tell you the honest truth, right? And then to get down there on the floor, and then when it came time for questions, right, you ask questions to get them to tell the truth, and they just blatantly lie. Like that was something I didn't expect. And I feel like we see it at a federal level, and you see it and you're like, I don't know, I kind of feel like that person's lying, right? But to actively be like and watch it on the floor was something that's very interesting, right? And so I think the lesson of to expect the unexpected, like wholeheartedly, but also the sheer power that people power has, right? And like we literally heard, like, if you will just like stop people from emailing us, right? Or if you'll stop people from calling, like we won't hear a bill or something. And it didn't happen every time, right? But it happened enough to be like, okay, if we could apply this same pressure to every bad bill, right? While also motivating people to get civically engaged in a way that they haven't been in a long time or probably never have been before, then we could really use the groundswell that we've been having over the past few years and shake that building, right? And really change the outcome of like what it looks like. So in the redistricting process, sorry, this was one thing that's really big that I didn't talk about, right? But in that redistricting process, Oklahoma picked up a new district, a new House district. And I think one of the, like, somebody from the Fraternal Order of Police has filed to run for that office now, right? And so that will be a race that's really, really watched. And so I would wholeheartedly encourage anybody, like it might seem really kind of dumb or something you're just like not interested in, but redistricting is a very, very important part of the legislative discussion, right? And to think deeply about the things that you truly care about, right? Like I think my big passion, right, is justice reimaginement and rebuilding, right? But that touches every part of Oklahoma, right? And anything that you're specifically passionate about touches every part of Oklahoma and everyday Oklahoman life, right? And so making sure you're continuously doing that work to find those intersectionalities and advocate for those as well is really important. So.
Right. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Where can we find you on social media?
Yes. So the last time I did this, all we had was the Mauree Turner OK. And that's like on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And then the website is just maureeturner.com. But since then, we have been elected. And so we also have like representative page for everything, and that's Rep Mauree Turner. And so that's where you'll find all the things that are kind of like specifically policy and just kind of like the interesting things that we get to do. Like I got to meet the president last week, so that was kind of
Yeah, I
cool.
saw that. Yeah.
And and so that was cool, right? To be able to try to talk to someone about like the big issues, right? And so it's always nice to have people who are better than the last, right? But always important to continuously push, right? Even our Democrats on important topics, right? And so, but yes, sorry, this was kind of a tangent. So yeah, so the rep page is like where all kind of the things that we do as representatives and all that information will kind of come from. And then more kind of volunteer opportunities, campaign issues, and things like that is like where it will all be on the at Mauree Turner or at Mauree Turner. Okay.
All right. Cool. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.